Thank you very much, Alan, and it's a pleasure to be here among folks who are thinking globally and acting locally. And that's what it's going to take. I thought I would touch on a few elements of the Think Globally part of this. If we compare global carbon emissions now to 1940, we have a 7-fold increase. After World War II, just huge, massive increase. And I'm sorry to report that the plot does not level out. It's still on a very upward trend. Or if you put it differently, if the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we hit 350, that goal, 350.org, the goal that maybe that would be equivalent more or less to a 2-degree temperature, we hit that in 1987. And we've been going up ever since, and we've been doubling the rate of carbon accumulating in the atmosphere from 1 part per million per year 30 years ago to 2 parts plus now. So it took 28 years to go from 350 to 400. At the current rate, it'll take less than 20 years to go from 400 to 450. These numbers, let's set them aside for a moment, because what it translates to is real impacts on the ground everywhere. Now here in Oregon, we see it in our extended fire season. It's now 60 days increased over the last 40 years. We see it in the greater pine beetle infestations because the winter isn't as cold to knock them back, kill them back. We see it in the loss of snowpack in the Cascades, which means less water for irrigation and for farming. It means warmer, smaller streams for fishing. We see it over on the coast where the carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere is converted through wave action. The ocean absorbs it and becomes carbonic acid in the ocean. So you have an ocean that's 30% more acidic today than before the Industrial Revolution. And if you want to look at a precise impact, the oyster population, oysters are having trouble forming their shells, baby oysters, because of that greater acidity. What else is going to be affected in the seafood chain? So if you look at this, really the carbon pollution is an assault on rural resources. It's an assault on forests, on fishing, on farming. And we need to realize that because we've got to convey a conversation that includes all Americans, urban and rural, in taking this on. We can't afford to have this be a partisan discussion. We need to pull in the red and the blue in America to fight to save this blue-green planet. So it was, Alan mentioned the fight over Arctic drilling. And if we are going to slow and reduce and stop the increase in carbon pollution, we have to leave 80% of the fossil fuel reserves that we know about already in the ground. So if we need to leave 80% in the ground, why are we issuing leases for more exploitation on public lands? That's something within our control. So this is the Keep It in the Ground movement. That is a piece of it. A second is fracking on public lands. A third is a Keystone Pipeline. A fourth is offshore drilling. And a fifth is coal leases on public lands. All of those need to be pieces of the conversation. Thank you. I was waiting for you all to stand up and come. So speaking of thinking globally, acting locally, here it is. An important conversation to take place, and I'm sure you all are focused in on it. So that's my review of the global framework, and it's why I'm championing the end to Arctic drilling. We need to take our chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which we took over in April, and not just say no to U.S. drilling, but lead the Arctic nations in making the entire Arctic off limits. So that is a piece of this Keep It in the Ground movement. And with that, I think I'm going to turn this over to my colleague. Thank you.
Firstly, of course, I have to thank Senator Merkley for his comments. Next, Now please welcome an Oregonian who has represented the state first in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1980 and then the Senate since 1996. Notable among Senator Wyden's efforts have been his support for renewable energy and his opposition also to the Keystone Pipeline.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing. And I look out in the room and it reminds me of my early days when I was director of the Gray Panthers. Political change rarely starts in a bunch of government buildings. It doesn't start in Washington, D.C., for example, and then trickle down. It's almost always bottoms up. In other words, when you go out and make the case for progressive policies, exactly the kinds of things my colleague outlined, that's what really moves elected officials. And it's pretty obvious that the issue of climate change is not an abstraction. It is very, very real. And we are seeing it constantly. I was chairman of the Senate Energy for a period of time. We began the effort then to try to shift the priorities to hydro and renewable and solar and wind, all of the non-fossil fuels. But the reality is, it is getting so hot and so dry out there now. This summer, when I met with Forest Service officials, they said, Ron, it's like the fire season doesn't end anymore. Literally. It used to be when we'd have a fire briefing, the Oregon Congressional Delegation, we'd have the briefing in like June or July or something like that because that's when fires were. Now I have my briefing in the winter because we have fires in the winter. And it is not happening by osmosis. Climate change is very profoundly affecting it. Now I want to talk specifically about what I have been working on lately, and I've made a major proposal recently on behalf of the Senate Democrats, the progressive Democrats who feel so strongly about a fresh approach on energy. As you know, in the tax code, in effect, billions of dollars are spent in the tax code. This is your money. In other words, you send your 1040 form joyously to Washington, D.C., and then a bunch of money is spent through the tax code through something called tax expenditures. Right now in the tax code, the fossil people are up here, and their brakes are permanent. The renewable people are down here, and their brakes are anything but permanent. They're really temporary in nature. And I am using my position on the Senate Finance Committee to change that. My goal, friends, is to get as close to parity as we possibly can, because then we're really going to make it possible for renewables to get out of the gate. And here's the specific proposal, so you'll all know about it, and I'd be very grateful to have the support of SOCAN on this, and many, many progressive organizations around the country have already come out in favor of it. Right now, 44 separate tax breaks under federal tax law. And as I said, it's kind of a crazy quilt, a hodgepodge of breaks, but the fossil people do very, very well under this. What I have proposed is to throw those breaks in the trash can. Just throw them in the trash can. This isn't an abstraction. This is a bill, a piece of legislation endorsed overwhelmingly by Senate Democrats, progressive Democrats, on this energy issue. We would throw those 44 tax breaks in the trash can, and we would substitute them for just three, that reward clean energy. The first is a reward for clean power, reducing CO2 emissions. The second is for clean transportation fuels. And the third is for energy efficiency. If we want to start what I think I hear you telling me, and what I hear my friend and colleague tell me, which is a renewable revolution, where renewables really have a place at the table. We start by fixing the tax code. That's where it ought to begin. $125 billion of your money goes out the door. What we have done in our legislation is create incentives for more green energy at less than half the cost. Keep up the good work. Senator Merkley and I will be working with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, both Senators Merkley and Wyden.